All right. So streaming is turned on. We are ready to get the class started.
Is the audio available?
Yep, audio is good. I can see the mic is good because last time my um, wireless mic ran out of battery. So at the beginning of the class, it was still good, and then somewhere in the middle of the class, the wireless mic just kind of stopped. So I don't know how long. Did you guys find out? How much of the lecture was silent?
Like I thought it was silent from the beginning.
Yeah, I think the whole thing was silent. Yeah.
The whole thing was silent?
The last lecture?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Hmm.
we didn't.
If
Okay.
anything, it was like 90% was good. I
90%.
think maybe there's a little bit of sound in the beginning, but
Hmm.
other than that, it was all silent.
Oh, okay. Well, I know for certain that it is not silent right now, and I replaced my battery, which should be good for about a week or two. So hopefully this time it won't go silent on us. All right, so the first thing we'll do today is to look at the solution of the homework assignment. Okay, so, but this is important because your second exam is going to be on the same type of material. So that means as I go through the explanation of the homework assignment, you kind of want to mentally compare that to your own answer. Okay, and every time there's a deviation, when I do something that is different from what you did in the homework, you don't feel shy to ask questions, okay? And don't feel shy to ask for clarification, because this is kind of like a major review session for your exam 2, is the explanation of homework assignment for the one that we just did, the Fibonacci one. Yep.
Exam 2 is just going to cover everything we learned so far? Or just like this new stuff with the subroutines and the...
So it will be including everything after the first exam, up to and including subroutines, but excluding arrays and subroutines.
Okay.
So it will include all the parameters, local variables, return value, and stuff like that. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna get started here, and then the first thing I need to do is to retrieve the homework assignment. So I'm gonna go pick up a tab, and oh, by the way, this is I'm taking this class. It's already, oh no, this is Design Hub. I thought it was drone class. That was fun too. I get to learn how to fly a drone. How many people here know how to fly a drone or have a license to fly a drone with Part 107?
You need a license?
I don't know what that means.
Okay. If you get a Part 107, as a quote-unquote license to fly a drone, you can ask for exemption. So there are places where you cannot fly a drone legally, but you can apply for exemption. Like flying a drone at night, okay, generally speaking, is not okay with the FAA. But if you have a Part 107, certification, then you can actually ask, the local authority to give you permission to fly at night, up at a certain place up to a certain height. So it's interesting. But that is not why we're here. So we'll go ahead and go back to this class. There we go. And then we'll go to the homework assignment, Fibonacci. And I'll do it the same way that you guys would do, which is right-click, save link as, save the file to some place, and then reopen it from open LibreOffice. So here's LibreOffice, Calc, which is the spreadsheet. And we'll open this new document. And temp, what is it? Fib. There we go. And where did it open it? Nope, it's got to be here somewhere.
I think that is the document. It's just like try algorithm.
Oh, right. Yep, you're right. Okay, so we got the right document. Oops. All right. And we're going to use this part here for the trace. So in the trace, we do need one column for comments because we do have a condition to evaluate. That would be line 3 in the subroutine itself. We have the usual line number, and then we want to see whether we have a global variable, and then we
Y, right?
y. That's right. Okay, so y is a global variable, and since the assignment does not say assume any particular value in y, so y does not have any assumed value, which means it starts with a question mark, and this is pretty much our precondition. All right, so far so good. This is the easy part, right? Do you guys have any questions that I can answer? No, it's okay. I mean, if you have a question. Okay, all right. All right, so we now get to the only line in the entire program, which is line 9, that is not inside the subroutine. So we go to line 9, okay? And you take a look at line 9 and go like, well, the last thing we need to do on line 9 is the assignment operation, which basically means whatever the right-hand side is, I'm going to take that value and update the left-hand side. In other words, I want to update y. But I don't know what value I need to use because the value that on the right-hand side is determined entirely by the invocation of fib. Okay, so that means that's the first thing I need to do is to invoke fib. But because fib returns a value, so instead of using return line number, I have to use return info, which is basically just information that I need in order to know what else do I need to do once the subroutine is done. Once this particular invocation is done, what else do I need to do? So that means I have to mark and say I have to go back to line 9, and what else on line 9 do I have to do? The entire assignment operation still needs to be done. Now, the invocation itself is replaced by a single question mark. In other words, invoke fib 3 goes to x is the portion that is replaced by a single question mark because that is the invocation that we are taking care of at this point of the execution. Is that okay? Do we have any questions about what we use to put into the return or the purpose of the return info cell? Why do we even have that column? That column is here. So what else when the invocation is done? Yeah. Wait. Okay.
So that basically is just telling you how you get.
That means when we are done with this invocation of fib, one, have a value because the question mark will turn into an actual value. And 2, when we get back to line 9, we still have to remember to update variable y. Then we get to post.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean that there's no local variable.
No. I'll set up the local variables next, or the parameter more like. So we'll set up the parameter next, but right now I'm just explaining what is the purpose of the return info cell and what role it is playing in the execution of a program like this with a subroutine that returns a value. So do we have any other questions about this particular step? Because instead of just mechanically telling you what to do, which I have done many, many times already, I also want to remind you why we are doing it. What is the context and what is the purpose of this column? Are we good? Okay. So now we can move on and allocate the additional column. The only additional column we need is for parameter x. So x has its own column, but the value of x is specified by the invoke statement. In this case, it is of 3. So x has a value of 3. This is how we set up columns D and E. Columns D and E are basically representing the first invocation of fib. So those 2 columns will continue to be in use almost up to the very end of the program. Not quite all the way to the end, but very close to the end. So once we have set up the columns for the invocation, we continue execution in the subroutine that we're invoking, which means we move on to line what?
3.
Line 3. Very good. Good job. So on line 3, we just have to evaluate is x greater than 2. Which x are we talking about? The rightmost column that is in use and labeled x. So in this case, it is column E, and it has a value of 3. 3 is greater than 2 is true. So that means we go into the then branch of the conditional statement, which is line 4. So when you look at line 4, the last thing we want to do on line 4 is to return a particular value. Okay, but I don't know what value I'm returning, because the value that I'm returning depends on the value of this invocation, the left invocation of fib, and also the right invocation of fib. I have to add up those two values. The sum is what I need to return. So I'm really quite far away from the actual return statement, because I first have to do the invocations. Is that part okay? Now, at this point, because this is an addition operator, you don't have to go from left to right. If you want to go from right to left, that's fine too. Okay? Because addition does not have the concept of short-circuited evaluation, so it doesn't really matter which way you start with. And some compilers will compile the code so that it actually starts with the right-hand side. But that should not impact the result of the operation. But since we mostly read from left to right, that's what I'll do. In other words, I'm taking care of the left-hand side of the invocation first. So that means when I set up the return info cell, and remember the purpose of the return info cell is to remind us when we get back onto this line, what else we need to do. So we have to say that we have to get back onto line 4. When it's done, with this invocation, the return is not done yet. This invocation would be, the left invocation would be replaced by a particular value. The addition is not done yet, and then the right invocation is also not done. So we just copy it as it is onto the return info cell. Now I know we need one more column for x, but I just want to pause here first to see if there are any questions about how column F is allocated and why we're putting this into column F. Do we have any questions? Okay, this is where some people may, yeah, go ahead.
So why would you copy the second invoke statement instead of just?
Because the second invocation is not being done. It remains to be done after we come back from this particular invocation. Because I can only deal with one invocation at a time. So if I'm taking of the left invocation, then the right invocation is merely something that I have to do later on. And that's why I put it here as my Google Assistant is interpreting what I'm saying, and it's definitely misunderstanding something. Which reminds me, next time I might need to turn off Google Assistant before class. So that is why we have to write, invoke fib x minus 2 goes to x, because that is not what we are taking care of now. What we are taking care of now is this portion, which corresponds to this particular invocation. Is that okay? How about the rest of the class? Do we have any questions at this point? We're good? Okay. Sorry? Go ahead.
Only one subroutine at a time. So you have to solve the first invocation and do that.
Yep. You can only do one invocation at a time. So this is also, if you don't like recursion because we're using one single subroutine and we keep calling the same subroutine from within itself, you can also look into the Ryan and Johnny and 12 example, because that one uses 3 different subroutines, but it illustrates exactly the same concept, but without the critical confusion of we only have one single subroutine. So you might want to go back and look into that particular example. Okay, once again, we have a parameter x. Every time you invoke fib, you have to specify x. So what should this one be? 2, exactly. Because this x here is referring to the x that is in the current invocation, which has a value of 3. 3 minus 1 is 2, and that value of 2 is being used to specify the next invocation, the x of the next invocation, which is column G. So column G has a value of 2, and now I'm done setting up the 2 columns for the second invocation of fib. So after I got all the columns all set up, I can now continue execution in the subroutine that is being invoked. And which line should I start with? Line 3 again, yes. So every time you invoke a subroutine, you always start from the beginning of the subroutine. It doesn't matter whether it's recursive, where you are in the recursion. If you invoke a subroutine, you always start from the beginning. Okay, so we get back onto line 3, and line 3 is asking the same question. X is greater than 2. But this time, this X, which is referring to the rightmost in-use column that is labeled X, that is no longer column E, it is now referring to column G. Okay, so column G has a value of 2. 2 is greater than 2 is false. Very good. So we say this is false, which means we are not going for the then branch, we're going to the else branch, which is on line 6. So when we get to line 6, this is a place when some people had some doubts and asked me questions, which is great, okay? Because the whole purpose of the homework assignment is to make it as confusing as possible, so that you can identify what concept you're not grasping, and come to my office. We can get it all clarified, or we can ask those questions in class. So we are now executing what is on line 6, which is return X. So now the question is, what am I going to do when we execute a return statement? We kind of know the mechanical part, right? Which is to look up the rightmost in-use column that is labeled return info, copy and paste the cell, and then replace the question mark with whatever we're returning. That's the mechanical part of it. Okay, which is basically just looking up the rightmost, which is this one here. It is still in use, so we copy and paste it here. Okay, and then the second thing we do is to replace the question mark with the value that we are returning. So note, we are saying to return the value. So that means I'm not replacing the question mark with X. I'm returning the question mark with the value of X. Is that okay? So this is really important, because otherwise, the result of the entire operation will be different. Okay? So what am I returning? I'm returning X. What is X? X, the rightmost column that is in use, that is labeled X, has a value of 2. So we are returning a value of 2, so the question mark is replaced by 2, not X. So is that part okay? Mechanically, do we have any questions about what this step is doing? Okay. Now, in terms of conceptually, what are we doing here? Conceptually, we're basically saying there's an invocation of fib, which was originally replaced by a single question mark, but that invocation is supposed to give me a value to add with something else. Okay. This is the moment when we have just resolved what that value is. So that's why we are replacing the question mark, which is taking the place of the invocation itself, with the actual value that we're returning. But we do not make use of that value at this point. All we do is to say, somebody asked me for a value, here it is. But we are not going to do something with that value just yet. Is that okay? So it's important to understand that the return statement, all it does is to say, somebody asked me a question and here's the answer. But I don't really care what you're going to do with that answer. Is that good? Okay? All right. But we are not continuing execution on line 4 yet. Okay? Because all we did was to say, when we return to line 4, this is what line 4 is going to look like. But we are not going back to line 4 just yet, because right now we are going to end define sub, which is on line 8. On line 8, what we are doing is we say we're at the end of the invocation of a subroutine, okay, which means where am I supposed to go back to? This is when you make use of the return info cell. Because the idea of this entire column, as well as this entire column, is to say when the subroutine is done, where am I going back to, and what else do I need to do when I get back onto that line? Okay, so this is the moment on line 8, when we execute line 8, that is the moment when we copy and paste the return info cell entirely into the line number column, I have to double check and make sure everything is still being captured. And then once we have done this step here, then we have no use of these two columns anymore because both of these columns are allocated on a per invocation basis, and the second invocation of fib is done at this point. So now we have to go back and say these columns are no longer in use, so they can be reused if I need to use it again. Are we doing okay so far with this step? The execution of line 8, which is corresponding to row 10 of the trace. Are there any questions at this point? So we are good? All right. So after line 10, you look up the line number column, after line 8, okay? After line 8, you look up the line number column. The next one is back to line 4. But this is why I do not just say we are going back to line 4, because if I just say go back to line 4, we'll be doing invoke fib x minus 1 goes to x again, because we would not know that that one is already done. That is the reason why we copy and paste the entire return info cell into the line number column. So this way we can actually keep track of what is done, what is yet to be done, on that particular line. Are we doing okay so far with all of this explanation? Because hopefully I'm not just explaining mechanically how it is done, but also the rationale behind the mechanics of what we're doing. Are we still doing okay? So now we're actually back to line 4. Now, ultimately, I want to execute that return, but I cannot execute the return just yet because I need to compute the sum. And in order to compute the sum, I got the left-hand side resolved to a particular value. That's great. But the right-hand side is not resolved yet. So now I have to invoke fib again, but using x minus 2 to specify the new parameter x when we invoke fib again. Is that okay? So this is when we go, okay, since we're invoking fib again, we have to allocate the leftmost unused column. And at this point, column F is the leftmost unused column because we have marked that column F and G became unused just one row prior to this. Is that okay? So we are going to reuse column F as well as column G with this invocation. Okay, so column F is being reused again as return info, but this time the return info, which is a clue so that I can remember where to go back to, we still have to go back to line 4 because the return is yet to be done. The 2 is already resolved, and hopefully by the time I'm done, this question mark will also be resolved. Because this question mark is representing the actual invocation that we are trying to resolve at this point. Is that okay? All right. So once again, we have to specify parameter x. Every time we call or invoke fib, we have to specify parameter x. And this time, according to this code here, we want x minus 2 to specify x. The first x in x minus 2 is referring to the x that I'm currently having access to. So that would be column E. Okay? Column E has a value of 3. 3 minus 2 is 1. I'm using that value of 1 to specify the value of the new parameter x. So now this is how we construct both of those columns. After the columns are set up, we can now continue execution on line 3 again, because remember, every time you invoke a subroutine, it always starts from the beginning. So on line 3, we ask the question again, x is greater than 2 is false, because this time, this particular x is referring to the rightmost in-use column that is labeled x, and that is now column G. But column G is not 2 anymore. That 2 is gone. The current value of x is 1. 1 is greater than 2 is false, so we go to the else statement again, which is on line 6. So line 6 is doing kind of the same thing as last time. It's just returning x. X has a value of 1 this time. So we're returning a value of 1. That means we have to look up the rightmost in-use return info cell, copy and paste it, change the question mark to the value that we are returning, which in this case is 1. Okay? Now, I understand a lot of you are itching to replace 2 plus 1 with 3 because we know that, but don't do it. Okay? Because the purpose of the return statement is just to answer a question that was asked earlier. Somebody asked you what is invoked fib x minus 2 specifies x. You have the answer now. You just answer the question. You just say, oh, the answer is 1. Adding 2 and 1 together is beyond answering just that question. You're making use of the answer already. And the return statement does not make use of the answer. Are we good so far? Now, this part can also be confusing because so we'll take a look at this part here. After line 6, this is all line 6 is going to do. After line 6, we get to line 8, and line 8 has got 2 things to do. One is it will look up the rightmost in-use column that is labeled return info. And once again, that particular step is done so that we know where to go back to after the invocation has ended and what else do we need to do on that line. Okay? And return info exists specifically for that reason. So that's why we are now copying this cell, the cell that is highlighted, to the line number column again. So that we know, okay, we have a record of what we need to do. Once we have done this step, then the 2 columns for the third invocation of fib would no longer be useful. So we would deallocate both of those columns. So those 2 columns would now be basically deallocated, and execution will now continue on line 4. So this is the 3rd time we get to the line 4, this particular line 4. But when we get to line 4 this time, we look at what we are returning and we say, yep, we can actually do the return now because we know what is 2 plus 1 as a numerical value. 2 plus 1 is just 3. So when we execute return on row 16 of the trace, we're basically just saying, let's return a value of 3. So now we go through the same mechanical process of looking up the rightmost return info cell that is still in use, copy and paste it, and then change the question mark to 3. So right now, column F is once again not in use. So that means the rightmost in-use column that has a label of return info is going to be column D. So we take column D, we copy and paste it, and then we change the question mark, which is representing a question that somebody asked me earlier, and I say, yep, I know the answer now. The answer is 3. And that's it. That is the extent of what the return statement does. We do not change Y at this point, because it is not my job to decide what to do with the value of 3. Somebody asked me about the question, the answer is 3, and I'm just answering, yep, the answer is 3. But do whatever you want with this answer later on. Are we good so far? Okay. So as far as line 4 is concerned, we are finally done with line 4. So after line 4, okay, according to this code, we go to the end if, which we don't track, and we end up on line 8 again. So line 8 has the same job that it had before. The first thing is it has to look up the rightmost in-use return info cell, which is now column D, copy and paste that cell to the next row so that we can remind ourselves where to go back to and what else to do on that line. And then we are done with this invocation. When you're done with an invocation, you remove or you deallocate all the columns that were used for this invocation. In this case, it would be column D and E. And then we use the strike through notation to say that they are now deallocated. And now execution continues on line 9. So line 9 doesn't look quite as bad as it was because now we know what the right-hand side is. The right-hand side has a specific numerical value, which means we can now go ahead and perform the assignment operation, which basically is to update the left-hand side with the numerical value on the right-hand side. So this is the time when we update column C, which is global variable y, and change that to 3, like so. So now we are finally done with line 9, we get to post, and we are all done. So are there any questions? Because I'm pretty sure most of you remember what you turn in, or what is the process, what was the process when you go through this particular homework assignment. So do we have any questions? Yep.
So on row 17,
Uh-huh.
I forgot to write 8 as the line number. I did the allocation. but
Okay.
write 8.
You forgot to write down the 8?
Yeah.
It's not going to be a big thing. Yep. I forget sometimes, to write down the line number. But the fact that you have, okay, so there are a few other key things that I need to look at before I determine whether points will be taken off, is whether this is here, okay, and whether y is updated to 3 after this row. Yeah, so then it's fine, because the ordering is important. Forgetting a line number is not the end of the world. Okay, any other questions? Yep.
Line 16 here is like,
Row 16.
yeah,
Row 16 of the trays is here.
2 and 1 is like inside the parentheses. Is important to have parentheses or not?
The parentheses are not particularly important, so if you don't use parentheses, it's fine. Yeah, I just use parentheses because I want to kind of emphasize we had a question mark in there, and that's why we had the question mark in parentheses, and question mark in parentheses, and question mark in parentheses, to emphasize that is what we're dealing with. But without the parentheses, it means the same thing. It's okay. Any other questions? No other questions? Really? Okay, well, this is basically, as far as recursion is concerned, it is as confusing as it can get. Okay? So are we truly okay with this?
Just want to look at it for a while.
Well, we can look at it for a while. That's fine. So are we good? It is still being recorded, so we don't have to be too worried that this screen will go away. It's still being recorded. I can also save the file, and send the file to all of you, so you have a copy of the document itself. We good? Okay. All right. Excellent. All right. So the next thing we're going to do, which is, I'm considering the homework assignment done. Okay. Now the grading may take a while. Okay. So that means, when you work on something like this, I'm hoping that, okay, what if somebody complains to me and go like, I lost my own copy of the homework assignment, and what am I going to do to compare my submission with, the actual key? What would be the answer to that question? Sign into Canvas, go to the homework assignment, and there's a link to download whatever you turn in, so that you have, because so you can basically look at Canvas as a backup. Okay, whatever you turn in as a document is still there, so you can download that document and then compare that with the version that I have today, and look for differences. Okay, if there's a difference somewhere, see if you can explain what that difference is, and explain what is the thought process at the time when you were doing the homework assignment. Are we good so far? Now that process won't work for people who are copying the answer from somebody else, because there's no thought process other than, what is that again? All right. So we're good here? All right. So now we're going to go take a look at the shared drive. Okay. So the shared folder is linked from course information, has always been there. So we'll take a look at the shared folder, and we'll go find exam 2 from last semester. So let me see if I have that. That's only exam 1. I don't have exam 2. So let me upload exam 2. So now we can actually take a look at exam 2. I may not have exam 2. Let me check first. So,
You said the exam 2's on the 28th, you said?
huh?
When did you say exam 2?
1 week from today. And let's see, it's Monday, Wednesday. Let's see, do I have exam 2? No, I don't have exam 2 here. Yep. Oh, I posted on Canvas? Okay, we'll take a look. Nope, wrong one. Nope, wrong class. This is the right class. Okay, here's exam 2. That's from more than 1 semester ago, but we can use that. We can take a look first. And I'm going to download it because it's really hard to see from here. All right. So it opens up as a spreadsheet. There are a few questions. So we can go with this, because in terms of what kind of question I may ask, it's still about the same, even though the format has changed. This is still about the same as usual. Okay, basically, it's open book, open notes. So when you go through the video or when you go through the explanation that I did in class, it might be helpful to help you to annotate the trace. Okay, so that you understand what is going on for each step. But you are allowed to bring as much as you want, anything that is printed on paper or handwritten on paper prior to the test. But no electronic devices other than a scientific calculator. Okay? So that takes care of this part here. Use the same trace convention that we use in class. So hopefully by now you guys understand what the convention is. All right. So if you think a loop is infinite, you want to indicate and say that I think this loop is infinite and then explain why that is infinite. Or if you think an algorithm is going to access a non-existent element in an array, explain that. Okay, explain that. Okay, I think at this step of the trace, it is going to access an element of an array that does not exist. So just tell me something is wrong. Okay, if you think the algorithm is doing something that is wrong. Okay. So that's just convention. Get it out of the way. Yep.
Did you put any algorithms that are wrong on the test? Like that you know for sure, like it's like.
I cannot remember. That's the best answer I can tell you, which is true. I cannot remember whether I have intentionally put something that is wrong in a test. All right, so this is the first algorithm. We want to, so your answer will still be a trace of the algorithm that is given to you. So in this case, it has arrays involved, and then the array is based on your student ID has 7 elements. Okay, so if I read the first line, okay. So this line says, okay, trace the following algorithm. Assume the precondition of an array A that has 7 elements is used, is based on the student ID where A bracket 0 is, I think is the first, it doesn't let me do that easily. Huh? Oh, okay. No, I just need to, I want to find out what is written on that line. Okay, that is, okay. That is based on, okay, there we go. That is based on your student ID where A bracket 0 is the first, in parentheses, leftmost digit. Okay, I just want to be absolutely clear about that. Okay, all right. So now, if that is the case, what is this algorithm going to do?
Wait, so we use our own student ID number?
Hmm?
So we use our own student ID?
Yes. So the idea is everybody will have a slightly different trace.
That's crazy.
It's not crazy. It doesn't put more work on you, put more work on me. Yep.
Are we gonna have a question where we have an array instead of a subroutine?
No. So there won't be a question with an array inside a subroutine. So don't worry about how those two concepts interact. So you will have subroutine questions, you have array questions, but no overlap in this particular exam. Okay? All right. So in this case, there's definitely no overlap because there are no subroutines. So we'll go ahead and trace through this particular algorithm. So we'll go ahead and edit document. So at the end of the class, someone can remind me to upload it so that you guys can have a copy of this. So new window, and sheet 1 is the question, and sheet 6 is going to be the answer. Okay. All right. So we definitely need one for comments, and let me just bump it up by 1 notch just to make sure it's more readable. We got line number, and everything is global because without subroutines, there's no way that we can have local variables. Okay, so everything is global this time. We got I, we got S, and we got array A. Okay, and array A has 7 elements. So we have element 0, element 1, element 2, element 3, element 4, 5, 6. There we go. And element 6 is the last one because now we have exactly 7 elements. Okay, and we'll just go ahead and invent a particular student ID. So we'll just use a particular student ID. I'm gonna say 1, 7, 2, 5. Let's see, 6, 8, 0. Okay. So the chances of this actually matching a particular student ID in this class should be pretty slim, but there's a chance. Okay. And that is our precondition. The other 2 variables start with unknown values because we were not told by the exam question to assume anything in the other 2. So this is our precondition. This also means the precondition is significant. Okay, you have to make sure that you have a precondition specified in your answer. So we now start execution on line 1, and line 1 doesn't do much. All it does is to initialize variable I to 0, and in line 2 initializes variable S to 0. Oops. Okay, never mind. Okay, there we go. Then we get to line 3. Line 3 has to perform the comparison. I is less than bar A bar is true, because what is bar A bar, by the way? 7, exactly. 0 is less than 7 is definitely true. So now we get to line 4. Okay, we might need more space on column A because this condition is a little bit longer. So it says A bracket I mod 2. So let's compute this first, okay? Because we have to compare this to 1. So what is A bracket I? What is I? I is 1, right? Excuse me, I is 0. So A bracket I is A bracket 0, which has a value of 1. So what is 1 mod 2? Okay, 1 mod 2 is the remainder of 1 divided by 2. It is 1. 1 divided by 2 has a remainder of 1. Why? I got 1 candy. I got 2 kindergarten kids, and I have to evenly distribute my candy. But only whole, I cannot break my candy up. Okay? So how do I do the division? Each kid gets none, right? The remainder is how many candies is still in my pocket? 1 candy. Okay? So 1 mod 2 is 1. The remainder of 1 divided by 2 is 1. Is that okay? Okay. So now that we know it is 1, so the question is, does 1 equal to 1? Yeah, okay. So we go to line 5. Line 5 doesn't do much. All it says is, the S variable is whatever it has plus a bracket I, which is column E. So now it has a value of 1. Is that okay? I mean, it's just 0 plus 1, and and then we store it in S. Okay. After line 5, where do we go? It's a little bit tricky, but it should not be too tricky. Hmm?
3, 9, 3.
No.
9, 4.
No.
Line 7.
No. You guys are just throwing darts.
Line 9.
Line 9 is correct. We get to line 9 because we are done with the conditional statement, because line 5 is the only thing in the then branch. Okay? When you're done with the then branch, you are done with the conditional statement. The conditional statement ends on line 8. But we don't trace line 8 because all it does is to say, yep, here's the end of the conditional statement. We don't trace that. But it does have something after that. It has line 9, which is just the increment of I after that. We have to perform line 9. Okay? So is that okay? Does everybody understand why we have to go to line 9 after line 5? Okay. So on line 9, all we do is to increment I, which is used as an indexing variable. I goes from 0 to 1, and now we get back to line 3. I is less than bar A bar is true because 1 is less than 7. We get to line 4. A bracket I mod 2 equals to 1 is, what is 7 mod 2? 1. 1 equals to 1 is true, right? So once again, we get to line 5. So when we get to line 5, we take the existing value of S, which is 1, and then we add the value of A bracket 1, because I equals to 1 at this point, which is 7. So once we add those two values up, it is now 8. Is that okay? All right. And then we get to, once again, where do we go? Line 9, very good. And line 9 is going to increment I from 1 to 2. Then we get back to line 3 again. I is now 2. 2 is less than 7 is true. Then we go to line 4. A bracket I is now 2. 2 mod 2 is 0. 0 equals to 1 is false. Yep. Then we go to the else branch, which is on line 7. And what that is going to do is to subtract A bracket I from S. Okay? So we take the current value of S, and then we subtract A bracket 2 from it, and store that result back into S. Are we good? Okay, are we okay so far? Okay. And then we get to line 9 again. We increment I, so it goes from 2 to 3. We go back to line 3. I is less than bar A bar is true. We go to line 4. A bracket I is now 5. 5 mod 2 is no. It's 1, right? 1 equals 1 is true. Okay. Then we go to line 5. We add A bracket 3 to the existing value of S, and then we update S with that, and then we go to line 9, which just adds 1 to I. I goes from 3 to 4. Then we get back to line 3. I mean, at this point, it is really kind of just boring. Okay. So we get back to line 4. A bracket I is now referring to column I, which is 6. 6 mod 2 is, what is 6 mod 2? 6 mod 2 is 0. Very good. And 0 equals to 1 is false. There we go. So now we go to line 7. And then this value is now whatever it has before minus A bracket 4, which is 6. In other words, we're adding all the odd numbers and we're subtracting all the even numbers. Okay. So do you guys want me to keep going, or do you think you got the idea? Finish it? Okay, sure. So after line 7, we get to line 9. I mean 4 to 5. I mean, we really just have 2 more iterations to go, so it's not that big of a deal. Okay. I'm just trying to scroll this down. Here we go. Okay. So get back to line 3. I is less than bar A bar is true because 5 is less than 7. A bracket I, which is A bracket 5, is 8. 8 mod 2 is 0. 0 equals 1 is false. And that's on line 4. And then since it's false, we go to the else branch, which is on line 7, and we subtract. So it becomes 5 minus 6. Oh, 5 minus 8, right? There we go. So now we get to the negative side, which is okay. Nothing says we cannot go for negative values. We go to line 9, we add 1 to I. I is now 6. We go back to line 3. I is 6, bar A bar is 7. 6 is less than 7 is true. We go to line 4. A bracket I is A bracket 6, which is 0. 0 mod 2 is, what is the remainder of 0 divided by 2?
0.
I got no candies. I got 2 kids who want candies. Each kid gets none, right? But how many candies do I have in my pocket? 0. Yep. So 0 equals 1 is false. We go for the else branch again. We go to line 7. So we take whatever S has, and then we subtract 0 from it, which doesn't change anything, but that's the equation. Oops. Okay, excuse me. Let me do that one more time. It is negative 3 minus the 0 here. And that gives us the same thing, not surprisingly. And then we get to line 9. We add 1 to I. I goes from 6 to 7. We go back to line 3 to compare I to bar A bar. This time it is no longer less than, it is false. And we get to post because there's nothing after line 10. So that's kind of what you need to do. And of course, grading this is a lot of fun because everybody's answer is slightly different. But don't worry, I have a program to help me generate the expected result. So it's easy for me to just kind of check, okay, is this resembling what it should look like?
So there's a program that traces algorithms for you.
Well, I just write this program in a particular programming language and have it to crank out, the conditions and what the values would be for each row. All right. So do we have any questions about number 1? Okay. Hopefully it's not too much because this question is relatively simple. It's a little bit tedious. Takes a little bit of time. So question 2 is the one that has subroutines, but this one also has got arrays, stuff. So it's not going to be. So I will not put in array elements like this in your test. Okay. So what I'll do is I'm going to change this a little bit to a format that I can actually use in your test. Okay? All right. So instead of using array indexing, I can just say replace all the A zeros, okay, with the first digit of your student ID. Okay? So let's say that's 1. Oops, this one you cannot. This one you cannot replace, but we can replace the rest. So let's say this is the ID, which is the same as last time, which is A17, what again? What was the ID that we used earlier? Okay, let's check. There you go, 2, yep, okay. So this is 2 and 5, 6. There we go. Now it becomes a legitimate question again. Because now it's not mixing, array indexing and subroutines. It's only subroutine there now, right? All right. So we look at this. Okay, let me open up a new tab for the trace. And this one is a little bit tricky, in terms of how I position the trace window, because this line is kind of long. It's taking a lot of space. But before we do anything else, we want to kind of figure out how do we deal with this? Which program does it resemble? Remember, Johnny and Ryan and 12? That's kind of the same thing, except this one has got parameters too. So it's mixing and matching. We have invocations that return the value, but also we also have parameters to pass to those subroutines. Okay. So the question is really asking, do you know how to trace this? What is going on when we have to execute something like that? So that's basically what the question is really asking. All right. So let's go ahead and trace it. I just have to really keep an eye on what is visible on the screen and what is not. So we got line number. We don't need comments anymore. There are no conditions to evaluate. Do we have any global variables? Now remember the analysis of names to identify things. Yes, go ahead. Z, X. X on line 7 on the left hand side, that is not a local variable. It's not. This bival X only applies to XYZ. This X is not in the subroutine XYZ, so this X is not, is not declared. Anything that is not declared is basically a global. So we do have one global variable X in this case. Okay. And since I did not tell you guys to make any assumptions, it is unknown to begin with. Is that okay? All right. So now we move on to line 9, which is the first line that is outside of the subroutine of any subroutine. So line 9 says, okay, let's invoke main. And we look at main. Main does not return a value. It doesn't have local variables. So we just need a return line number in this case, because we don't need return info unless the subroutine returns a value. When you look at main, it has no return statement, so it's safe to use return line number, which is a little bit better because it just has to say which line are we going back to, so that's easier to track. After that, we get to line 7, and then line 7 is an assignment operation. It's an assignment statement because we see the left arrow. We know eventually we want to update X, but we can't do that yet because the value that we're going to use to update X has to do with the summation of a constant of 1, the result of one invocation of XYZ, and the invocation of XYZ again. So we cannot do the assignment yet, but we can handle one of the two invocations. The operator is a plus here, which means the order is not really important. You do not strictly have to follow left to right. It can be right to left, whatever you want. So, but we do need a return info in this case because the invocation of XYZ requires to go back to the same line because XYZ returns a value. So we are going to have to replace the entire invocation here with a question mark to basically represent the value that will be returned. So when we get back, we want to go back to line 7. The assignment operation still needs to happen. The 1 plus still has to happen. But this particular invocation, the first one, is going to be replaced by a particular value. The second invocation still has to be just spelled out exactly the way it is because that has not happened yet. Is that okay? All right. Now that is just the return info cell. We also need to set up two other columns because we have two other parameters. We have parameter X and we have parameter Y. Both are passed by value. So what are we using to pass to X? -5. -5? No.
7.
It's 7. Now how do we know it is 7 but not -5? Because this is the middle invocation. This is the middle part of the addition. So we are taking care of this particular invocation, and it specifies 7 to parameter X and -2 to parameter Y. Is that okay? All right. So X starts with the value of 7, and then Y starts with the value of -2. Then we get into the subroutine after this. The first line of the subroutine is on line 4. Doesn't do anything too fancy. All it does is to look at X and Y and then do the addition. So if I make the columns with look better, this is what it looks like. So on line 4, we are going to copy and paste the return info cell, And then all we're going to do is to say, what is x plus y? What is the value of x plus y? X is 7. It's just 5. So we replace the question mark with 5, and we're done with line 4. We get to line 5. Line 5 has 2 jobs to do. One is to copy and paste the return info cell into the line number column, just like that. And then the second one is to say, okay, all the columns that we allocate for this particular invocation are now deallocated. So they're all marked with a strike through. Is that okay? Are we good? Okay. So now we continue execution on line 7, except line 7 doesn't look like quite as bad as it was originally, but we still have one more invocation to go. So that means we have to invoke xyz again, but this time we are passing -5 to x, we're passing 6 to y. So I'm going to take care of those two first, because those are the two easy ones to take care of. Okay, so -5 and 6 go here. And then we have to specify the return info cell again. But this time when we specify the return info cell, we have to say that we still have to go back to line 7 because the addition or the summation has not been done. So we still have the 1, okay, we have x gets 1 plus, and then we have the first one resolved as a 5, and then the second one should now be resolved when we get back. So are we doing okay so far with this part?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So now we continue execution in the subroutine on line 4. Line 4 says return x plus y. X is -5, y is 6, so x plus y is going to be a 1. So we are returning a value of 1. That means we copy and paste the rightmost in use return info cell, change the question mark to a 1, and we're done. We do not say that 1 plus 5 plus 1 equals to 7, not right now. Okay? And then we get to line 5, the end of the subroutine. We basically deallocate the columns. Yep. Oh, okay. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky because I suppose I can scroll this up. There we go. So if I scroll up, then I can move the other one up a little bit. Thank you. Thanks for letting me know. So on line 5, okay, we are at the end of the subroutine. So we deallocate everything, but we also have to copy and paste the return info cell into the line number column. So, but this time when we get back to line 7, we know what to do because we know what is 1 plus 5 plus 1, which is 7. So we are changing global variable x to 7 this time. Okay. So we look at column A, and then we make it a little bit bigger, and then x is finally getting a value of 7, and that concludes line 7. After line 7, we get onto line 8. Line 8 is end define sub. So once again, we are going to deallocate everything that is allocated to this invocation. Which column would that be?
C.
Column C, very good. So, but before we get rid of it, we have to remember that we have to go to post next. So we write down post here, and then we say, well, okay, once we have made use of that column, we don't need that anymore. So we put, line 8, and then we put a post here, and then we indicate that column C is no longer in use on column 8, when we execute line 8. So we go to format, text, and then we strike through. So is that okay? Yep. Say again? Sure. So the question is, why is x a global variable in main? Okay. So within the context of xyz, this x is referring to the local definition of x, which is a parameter. So this x is not a global variable because within that context, x is already defined or declared as a parameter. On the other hand, when we on line 7 of main, this x has no declaration. There's no local x. There's no by val, no by ref, with the name of x. So without any local definition of x, it is by default a global variable. So are we good with this particular one? Any questions? Yep.
Will these documents be uploaded?
Yes, as long as somebody remind me to do it, at the end of today's session. Yep. All right. So that is another one. So let's take a look at the next one. That's the wrong one, wrong sheet. This is the wrong one too, so let me get rid of that. Okay, this is the question. Okay, there we go. So now we have something that looks like this. This is a combination of array and subroutine, so I cannot ask this kind of question in the test. And this one is a little bit harder to deal with without using an array, so I'm going to skip over this one. And this is binary search, which also has a mixture of subroutine and arrays. And this is the answer sheet. So that's all I can give you for now, because that's the test that I had, in the previous semester. But it gives you a taste of what you would, be working on in exam 2. Basically, we have arrays. And when we talked about arrays, the one particular algorithm that is important when we talk about arrays is binary search. So you have to go back and review binary search and understand how it works. Okay, I can ask a question like, this is binary search, but I artificially introduced an error into the original algorithm. And then the question is, trace it and tell me what problem is going to happen with the wrong binary search algorithm. Okay, so that's array, binary search, and then we deal with subroutines. Okay, so subroutine is kind of complex because there are many topics related to subroutines. We have by value parameter, by reference parameter, local variables, return value, and the original mechanism of invoking and returning from a subroutine. So all of those are in scope of exam 2 for this class.
How many questions?
I haven't decided yet. It kind of depends on what is the how much time it takes to answer each one. So the trade-off is I can ask more smaller questions where it doesn't take too long to trace, or I can ask a fewer questions, but each one takes longer to trace. So I still have to decide how I want to do this. So I would say between 4 to 6, okay? Between 4 and 6 questions for the entire test. So what you guys need to think about are the mixing and matching of concepts, okay? Now, I already said that there won't be mixing and matching between arrays and subroutines. So that one is definitely out, okay? But everything else can still be mixed and matched, okay?
Actually, I have a question.
Yeah.
How do you differentiate when you're supposed to use return info and return line number?
Return info versus return line number. Okay, so when you have a subroutine, when you're invoking a subroutine that returns a value, you have to use return info. When you are invoking a subroutine that does not return a value, you can still use return info. You just copy and paste the entire next line as your return info. But that's a lot of work when you can just say return line number, just go to the next line, right? So return line number is really a shorthand of return info when you just go like, well, start with the next line. Is that answering the question? Okay, all right. So let me give you an example of something that has a little bit of mixing and matching. I wouldn't say a lot of, but it is a little bit of mixing and matching. Okay, so I might give you something like this. Define sub, I'll call this post inc for post increment. This is going to be a very important concept in C++ programming, and it's also regular C programming. And it has by reference a particular parameter. We'll just call it n, okay? But it also has, I don't need to use a local variable for that. But I would just say this, okay? So it will perform a kind of typical operation, which is incrementing n by 1, but it also has a return value of n minus 1. And define sub. Okay, so that means every time you invoke post increment, you can expect a return value because it has a return statement here. Okay, so I'm gonna indent first. There we go. All right, and now we can define sub main. Okay, and in main we have a local variable which I will call x. Okay, x is starting with a value of 0. Okay, and then here is what I'm going to do to x. X is invoke post inc. I use x to specify n as a parameter. Okay. Yes, go ahead.
What does that two-way arrow mean?
The two-way arrow is used when we are passing something by reference. So it is just a notation for our pseudocode in this class to emphasize the fact n is a parameter, but it is also passed by reference. Whatever happens to n ends up happening to x. That's why it's a double-sided arrow instead of a one-way arrow where it says, well, this is how we specify the beginning value of the parameter, but whatever happened to the parameter doesn't go back to what you used to pass to the parameter.
Okay, so by value is the one arrow. And
Correct. Yep. All right. So we'll make this, I don't have that much time, so let's just do it this way. And define sub. And outside, we just say invoke main. Okay. All right. So this program has a few interesting things. The first one is it has no global variables. Because if you look at all the names used, every single name that we use, which is n within post inc and x within main, they all have a local declaration. So we do not have any global variables in this case. So let's go ahead and trace that. Okay. So when we trace this one, we do not need a comments column because there's nothing conditional about this. So we start with line number, and that's it. That's your entire precondition because we don't have any global variables to say anything about. Then we move on to line 11, which is invoking main. Main itself does not return a value, so we can use the shorthand of return line number of post. On the other hand, main does have a local variable x, and as a local variable, it always starts with an unknown value. So are we doing okay so far? Calling, just invoking main? Yeah? Okay. So within main, we get to line 8. Line 8 says x gets a value of 0. Okay. And then line 9 is the one that is a little bit complex. Because on line 9, we have to first figure out what is the right-hand side before we can perform the assignment operation. So the right-hand side involves the invocation of post inc, and post inc does return a value. So now we need a return info, which says, when the invocation is done, we go back to line 9. The assignment operation still has to happen, but the invocation itself will provide a value that we can use to update x. Are we doing okay so far with this? And then we have parameter n to take care of as well, because when you look at post inc, it has a parameter n, which is passed by reference. When you pass something by reference, you're not just passing the value, because when we look at x, x is column C, it has a value of 0. You do not use the 0 to specify parameter n. You say parameter n is also known as column C. It is an alias of column C, or you can say it's a reference to column C. Okay, so any one of those particular words is fine. It's a reference of, it is an alias of, both are acceptable. Yep.
So by reference, what does by val stand for again?
By value.
So just like that exact value.
Yep.
Instead of reference.
The value at that point. Yep. So now we continue execution in the subroutine, which is post inc, starting on line 3. Line 3 says, let's find out what n is, add 1 to it, and then store it back into n. So we look up n. N is also known as column C. It's a reference of another column. So when we are looking at the right-hand side, which is looking for the value of n, we track down what is column C. Column C has a value of 0, so n is 0 at this point. 0 plus 1 is 1, right? So we want to store that 1 back into n. We do not store the 1 in column E, because column E is a reference. We do not change the reference itself. We change what it is referencing. Since it's referencing column C is the one that is changed to a 1. Is that okay? All right? And then on line 4, it says return n minus 1. Well, nothing says still that I cannot do this, right? I mean, this is fully legitimate. N minus 1 is referring to column C. Column C now has a value of 1. 1 minus 1 is a 0. I'm returning a value of 0. Are we okay at this point? Are we good? Okay. So that means we have to look up the rightmost in use return info cell, which is this one, copy and paste it, change the question mark to the value that we are returning. What is that again? 0. Exactly. So let me ask you, what is the current value of X, or the current value of column C? It is still 1, exactly, okay? It is 1 at this point because line 9 has not happened yet, okay? After line 4, we naturally go to line 5, which is the end of a subroutine. The end of a subroutine has a few things to do. Look up the rightmost return info cell, which is this one, copy and paste it to the line number column, just like that, and then deallocate all the columns that we allocated for this particular invocation. Okay, so that part is pretty standard. Now we continue execution on line 9, which means X is now updated to 0. Is that okay? And after line 9, we get to line 10. Line 10 is the end of main. Main does not return a value, so it's a little bit easier to deal with because all we do is we look up the return line number, which is post, and then we just say post here, and then we deallocate the columns of this particular invocation, just like that. And the trace is done. So the concept of post increment is really interesting because post increment means, we are changing the variable that we are passing to the subroutine, but it's at the same time it's also returning a value. But the value that it's returning is not the updated version of the variable. It is basically the value before the update. Okay? So you might think, what is the whole purpose of post increment? That is something that you are going to find out in cisp300. And on top of that, okay, we still have 1 minute left, I think. Yep, both watchers agree that we have at least 2 minutes left. All right. So if I say this one is called post increment, don't you think there has to be something that is pre-increment? Yes? There is one, okay? So in C and C++ programming, you will also learn about pre-increment versus post-increment. The whole notation of C versus C++, the plus after the C is a post-increment operator in C++, the language. So the name of the programming language is a play of an operator that it has. Yep. And I think we are, we'll call it done for today.
Professor, the video from the last class doesn't have sound
Right.
in the fifth.
Yeah, because either I forgot to turn on the mic or it ran out of battery.
Oh, so there is no